Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that Kluge-Ruhe is located on the land of the Monica Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And since we are all joining from locations around the world, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous nations where each of us are located. And I encourage you, if you don't know who those nations are or who those people are, that you find out and that you learn more about them and their art and culture as well. I'm really excited to introduce Carol McGregor to everyone today. I was honored to get to spend a lot of time with her during her residency at Kluge-Ruhe, and we've missed her, so I'm excited to get caught up a little bit. And I'll start with a little quick intro. Carol McGregor is a woman of Aboriginal Wathaurung and Scottish descent who works with natural fibers, metal, and paper. She holds a Doctorate of Visual Art, a Bachelor of Fine Art, and a Bachelor of Contemporary Australian Indigenous Art, all from the Queensland College of Art, as well as a bachelor's of business studies from Massacre University. Her work has been in more than 60 exhibitions in Australia, and she has attended a number of residencies and has received numerous awards, including most recently the Commonwealth Games Commission. She has extensive experience working within communities to revive cultural practices, and her work is held in many collections, public and private, both in Australia, and her work is also in the Kluge-Ruhe collection. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to you, Carol. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to also acknowledge before I begin that we are all gathering together today on First Nations land, wherever you are. And I'd like to acknowledge their ancestors and also their cultural leaders, the cultural leaders of the past, of the present, and their emerging leaders. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Carol of Wathaurung or Wathaurung descent from the Kulin Nations of Victoria. And I'm coming to you today from Brisbane, which is in Queensland in Australia. We're in a winter's day and it's going to go below 20 degrees, so it's very cold for us here right now. I'm going to share my screen and talk to you about a little bit about what I've been doing since I've come at Kluge-Ruhe, and also how I've coped in quarantine, and also some of my art projects. So here we go with my PowerPoint. Don't know whether I should have put my glasses on.
You're good. Thanks.
So I'm coming to you today from Yarrabee. This is my backyard, and Yarrabee is the Yagara word, which is a local Brisbane Yagara word for the place of many gums. And I'm surrounded by gum trees. I'm surrounded by the bush, and I'm very fortunate that in quarantine that I can just walk outside and I can see nature. It's still going ahead. I've still got kookaburras, I've got little wallabies that come every day, and the kookaburras come, and this is one of the stone sculptures my son has made. We're surrounded by a lot of granite stone as well as the bush, and as you can see there's a wonderful little kookaburra there, and the bush wallabies is here too, sorry. They're rock wallabies in the bush. My time at Kluge-Ruhe was really special. To travel on the other side of the world and see something like this, a gallery of Australian Aboriginal art that has been cared for and been held in this special place, is something that I always refer to as a diamond. Not only do the staff acknowledge and respect the objects in this collection, but the ongoing community engagement that they have with Australia and with artists like myself. And I really feel privileged that we are able to come there and be on Monacan's lands and talk about our work, exhibit our work. So thank you very much. It was a great honour. And from this experience in artist residency, I'll talk about some of the outcomes for me and how they've affected to where I am right now. This is a little bit of my exhibition, Repositories of Recognition, which talked about fake art, but talked about the stereotyping of Australian Aboriginal people. And I work in possum skins and make contemporary possum skin cloaks, and that's been the inquiry of my doctorate. And I brought these possum skin vessels in to show the opposite to what these tea towels were. Authentic art. We're not just, and show the diversity of Indigenous art here. We're not just dot painting, which is that stereotype that seems to be manifested around the world. And we're trying to break through those stereotypes and show what our traditional arts and what our contemporary art practices are. This is just a close-up of some of the works. An apron based on traditional aprons that will be old aprons that the domestic, I call them domestic slaves. A lot of the Indigenous women were indentured into working in the station houses or for houses for people doing domestic chores, and then referencing stolen generations. You know, the tea towels are showing smiling young children when really the children would be taken away. So I've actually put in the text in this. And this work is actually currently being shown in another exhibition that just opened last week in Brisbane. So, and that's some of the tea towels, and I've sort of subverted some of the words. And I think that's part of my practice is unsilencing these histories and unsilencing these stereotypes. So each of these tea towels talks in many ways about those. I won't go through them all now, but I think the repositories of recognition catalogue is online for anyone that's interested in following that up. My time with these two special women who are here today, Lauren and Fenella, thank you so much for looking after me. I learned so much through these two women. Fenella took me bushwalking, and I really appreciated that. Look at the mists and looking at all the different plants and being outside in your country. My family loved the shot. They're very proud of me being in Lauren's Mustang, and this is one of the things that I really enjoy about artist residencies. You don't just get to make art and show art, you actually get to know people and make friends, and because you're there for a long time. So it was really important that we shared a lot of things, and I really appreciated being able to sit in Lauren's beautiful car. And I also had the opportunity to bring one of my daughters, Tate, with me. She was staying in Canada, and she came down to spend a few nights with me in the resident cottage, which was very special too, and was able to come on this journey for a little bit. And I appreciate that opportunity as well. Just some of my time there is so different than Australia. I got taken, I think it's Nicole took me to this wonderful craft store, and I was just blown away by the range of items that you could purchase and the low prices. So for an artist, this was incredible. I think I came away bedazzled by these beads and came away with, ironically, a few handfuls of beads from my experience, which I've used to make jewellery with my students. At the moment, my work is the Bachelor of Contemporary Australian Indigenous Art. I'm the program leader there at Griffith University, and with alumni Vernon Arkey and Tony Albert. So it's a very important degree program. So I do, I'll just go back to the beads. I do teach a lot with students, and I have shared some of the beads that I took from or bought from Virginia. I've taken them to the students, and they've been most appreciative to use them in their work. This is the vest. I'd only worked with possum skin cloaks before arriving at Kluge-Ruhe. Possum skin cloaks for us are very important parts of our, traditionally of our identity, and also in contemporary. They tell very important stories. Traditionally, you were given one skin when you were born, and then added onto that skin when you grew, your cloak grew with you, and mapped onto your cloak with stories and journeys of your mob, tribal patterning, maps of country. So each of your cloak was very, very special to yourself, and quite often you were buried in your cloak. And they are really important forms of identity, and also for me, art making. And I'd never made anything before outside of making cloaks and working with different Indigenous communities here, making possum skin cloaks and teaching people about the cloaks and the diversity of our art practices. And it was wonderful. I actually got to go to the drama school as part of Virginia University, and they lent me this model and helped me fashion this vest. And this vest, which I started at Kluge-Ruhe and cut it all out and got it all sorted exactly what it was going to be, I brought back to Australia and started to burn into the skins this patterning. And this is a new form of what I was burning and doing, I actually intertwined a whole lot of native plants from this area and talked about the flora and fauna on this particular vest. So this is all the burning, and then I marked this with ochres, local ochres, and coloured that in. And you can see that the burning actually creates these beautiful textures within the skins. I source all my possum skins from New Zealand, where they're ethically sourced. They have a government culling program there because possums are not native to New Zealand. They actually were introduced from Australia, so they're Australian brush-tailed possums. So, through this culling process, we're lucky enough to get these skins. And I visited the tannery where I get these skins from, and paid my respects to the animals and the whole process of tanning the skins and understanding where these animals came from. And as I said, I actually smoke the skins before I use them and actually pay my respects to the animal. And I think that's really important, to go through that whole process. And I've done that as part of my research into the possum skins. The stitch that you can see here is a feather stitch that I've been using. I've been taught by a Yorta Yorta elder, Glenys Briggs, to use this stitch in my cloak making, and it's a really easy stitch to teach other communities to make this stitch and keeps the skins very flat. So I enjoyed stitching everything up together, and here you can see some of the finished product of the vest, or finished vest, and some of the ochres and the colourings that I've made on this. So and this was shown in the I made an outfit. I've got given some white linen as part of the Commonwealth Games. We did a fashion workshop, and my daughter painted, Tate, who was there at Kluge-Ruhe, painted a larger version of one of the Banksias onto this linen, and that matched with the cloak. And here is the final fashion parade at the Commonwealth Games. It was held over 2 nights. And we've got a wonderful model, Perry Mooney, who modelled my outfit. And the outfit to the right of this is a little skirt made of possum tails, and a painted leather bustier that I've done as well on that model to the right. And she's got a woven wing. You probably can't see that very well in that image. Just another image of the fashion parade in the Commonwealth Games, and there's Perry wearing the vest. So I thought I'd like to show you that, because it's so interesting. You make something so far away, you bring it back, and that's what happened in the Commonwealth Games in 2018. Also in the Commonwealth Games, as Laura mentioned, I won this award to actually provide the sculpture, and this is the sculpture of called Acknowledging Place, and it's made of the local cottonwood tree leaves, which are, to me, are big, beautiful heart shapes. And I made this big public sculpture so that people could actually shelter under there, but sit under there. And actually, when I went to take photos, there was a family on the beach sitting under there. And you could sit there and actually acknowledge being on Aboriginal land. And that was the whole reason for this sculptural work, that it's a contemplation place, because these particular cottonwood trees are quite rare along the beachfront, but they used to actually populate the beachfront, were a really important source for a resource for the Yugambeh people. You could eat the little new tender shoots. The bark was used a lot for string making, for making nets and baskets. There was medicinal purposes in the roots. So the whole plant was used. And it was, as I said, it was a really important, significant resource along the coast. And there's not many of them along the coast. There's quite a few in the inland waterways. But they're a very beautiful tree, the cottonwood tree. And this is the sculpture from the other side. So that was really, and I was doing that sort of just before I left for Kluge-Ruhe, and came back and got right into it. And the sculpture, was part of one of the sculptural pathways for the Commonwealth Games as well on the Gold Coast. And ironically, I went to another project coming back from Kluge-Ruhe, and this is the leaves, the actual leaves of some cottonwood trees sewed together to make a cloak. And I worked with a community for a performative work, and this cloak was used in a performance. It was rolled up and used in a performance for the Commonwealth Games over 2 nights as well. And I wondered how I got this idea of sewing these leaves together to make this cloak, and it was really using materials that didn't really cost very much, but also that a lot of people could engage with. And again, it relayed back to that work of an acknowledging place. and you can see that the stitching the leaves are very fragile, very beautiful leaves, just the colourways. And I really enjoyed working with people on that project. But then I look back through my photos, and I was lucky enough to go to some galleries, and I saw for the first time one of El Natsui's cloaks. I think it was in New York, which I visited for a few days before I came down to Kluge-Ruhe. Again, this whole trip was an experience, experience that for an artist was so incredibly rich. So I think that if you look back to that cloak, it's really influenced by my visit, I think, and seeing this incredible work by El Natsui. I'd seen photos of his cloaks before, but I'd never really physically experienced one before coming on my Kluge-Ruhe visit. So again, these little added extras, I think, adds to your practice. You never know when they might come out. I also got to go to the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian, and I went to many museums of the Smithsonian actually, and I really appreciated having that time. And Henry drove us there as a party. We had it at conference, Oceans of Exchange, and after the conference a party of us went to the Smithsonian, and we were lucky enough to go behind the scenes as well. But I also went to quite a few of the other museums. I had a few days, and just going and seeing the Museum of the Natural Museum of the African American History and Culture. I just wanted to get that right. And also the Natural Museum of the American Indian. Both those museums brought home to me that we all have very similar stories. First Nations have very similar stories, within the cloaks, as you can see here, and also that civilizing of the nation. We have this assimilation practice, and you look at this, I saw this civilization, the assault of the Indian nationhood here on the left, and I realized that we have very similar stories, and that really connected with me too. And I think that global connection I felt for the very first time going through some of these stories. And also how traditional knowledge has shaped the worlds. Again, that was part of that discovering, because that's how I felt in Australia, but just seeing that it's, again, nationwide at the NMAI, I have spent a lot of time there. I think I spent a couple of days going backwards and forwards to this beautiful museum and understanding just some policies that they have there about looking after objects. And we did visit behind the scenes to the Cultural Resource Centre with Uncle Terry Snowball, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. This is part of the African American History and Culture Museum, which I was very fortunate to come into, and one of the, after going through all these hard histories, coming to the reflection pond, I think that again might have reflected in my work, some of my work, that to sit down and reflect on what you see and just spend time with your thoughts on everything. And I think that was a really strong moment for me too. And then I took a lot of photos and how relevant in the Black Lives Matter movement that's coming through, that our lives matter. And some other quotes. I took a lot of quotes that I show my students, some of these works too. They really inform some of the lectures that I take now. And this is here in the Cultural Resource Centre, just out of Washington, that Henry from Kluge-Ruhe took us to. And we met, as I said, Uncle Terry Snowball. And I think the first thing walking into this building was the respect paid to the cultural objects. This particular structure in the building acknowledges the four winds, and also that whole philosophy, that First Nations philosophies acknowledged at the core of the building before you even enter. So, and I felt that that was really special. It's something that we just haven't done here in Australia. So that, and then going into the community room where you have a fire pit, where you can do smudgings, where you can cleanse yourself spiritually before you see the objects, before you handle objects, and before you leave. And I think that those cultural respects and protocols would just, again, hit home. And I show my students this and how important these things are and how we should look for this in the future. And I went to the National History Museum storage rooms to particularly look at this cloak. It's a cloak that was taken in 1839 in the Wilkes exploration expedition from America, and it was taken from the Hunter River Valley, which is just north of Sydney, if you know of Sydney. So this cloak here is a very old cloak. It's probably the oldest cloak of Australian Aboriginal people that we have left. There's only 3 whole cloaks left in the world, and this is one of them, and probably the most intact. And it was very beautiful to be next to this object, to actually be with it for a little time. And for the first time I saw it was in this drawer with a lot of objects from other countries. It had a different feeling, this whole building, than going into the Cultural Resource Centre that I showed you before for the Native American. Coming and seeing our objects here felt a little bit cold. I had to bend down to actually see in the drawer, and I felt a little bit empty when I left that night. And I asked the staff at the Smithsonian if I could come back and spend a little bit of time with this cloak. As part of being a contemporary cloak maker, I just wanted to be with the makers of this cloak and just understand this cloak a little bit more. And it was wonderful that the staff said, yes, of course, come back in a couple of days, and that fitted in with my time frame to go back to Kluge-Ruhe before I went back to Kluge-Ruhe. And they let me spend time with the cloak, and they opened it all out for me in a room, and I could actually study this cloak and just be with it. Because when objects for us are folded away like that, and with other objects so far away from country, it's something that, I don't know, there's a feeling that you look at it and you just feel a little bit sad. But then I felt an immense honour that I had the time to be with it, to understand it, and also had very privileged to be there as well. And that's something, again, facilitated by Kluge-Ruhe staff to actually go and do this. And this was a very important turning point in my thesis and my doctoral studies, and also my cloak making. I was able to study the stitching. And when I talked about the cloaks being made from one skin, and then that grew as you grew and your cloak grew and added onto it, you could see that in this cloak. And I could spend that time and see that beautiful stitching, but see the different hand, well, I call it the different hands of the maker. On the left-hand side, you can see it's quite a different tension. And for those who knit and sew, you know what tension's all about. Tension in the stitching there. There's 4 different hands, it seems. And then you've got that one seam that goes right across, and look at the tension and the mastery of that stitch. These skins would have been cut with a sharp stone or muscle, and they would have been flattened together and with a bone or holes pierced, and then kangaroo tail sinew is actually threaded through the holes. And if you look at that, and it was so fine, if you look at how big a possum skin was, and it was quite small, it was almost like machine stitching. And when you understand that process, I just looked at it and went, oh, the masters. But just looking at the different tensions and the different hands of the maker, I could really understand that process. I don't talk about the designs in my thesis. This is not my cloak from my area. And I call it the Wonarua Awabak or Warramai cloak, from the 3 mobs or the 3 tribes that would around that Hunter River Valley area, where there was a mission where we think that Charles Wilkes gained the cloak from. So, and I look at that, and I do talk about that. You can see the designs with the mussel shell of the stone has been scraped into the skin, and then ochres are rubbed into those beautiful designs. And that was one way of actually putting on the artwork, but also it did protect the cloak from insect attack, and also made the skins very supple. Because the possum skins, this made it also, with fats rubbed into it, very waterproof too. So the cloaks were waterproof and very warm. And when colonisation happened, Aboriginal people had no access to possum skins, because you needed around about 60 or 70. If we go back to this cloak, it's only a small cloak. But a large adult cloak would have had around about 60 to 70 possum skins. So when there was no access to food, the food resource of possums, which was a really important food resource, and no access to skins, the government introduced a blanket list where people got 2 woolen blankets a year given out, but they weren't waterproof and they weren't as warm as these beautiful possum skin cloaks. The other thing, I just wanted to show you some more stitching, and you can see the different tensions. You can see the holes that the awl has pierced and the sinew put through. Again, that's a different tension to this one. So it's just really interesting. I love, but you can really see the sinew, and I've seen another cloak with sinew, and the sinew is exactly the same, that translucency of that sinew. So I studied the stitching a lot, and I took a lot of photos, and I compared it, and I went and actually spoke to the Wannerua elders, and I've given them all these photos, many of these photos, and all my notes that I took so that they could understand what I saw, because they haven't been over there, and yet that cloak comes from their country. So it was important that I, as part of my protocols, that I went back to those people and spoke about what I'd seen and my work, and asked permission to actually use these photos in my thesis and also in my work. So, in which I did gain permission, and I shared with them all the research that I did around this cloak. The one thing I really enjoyed too was looking at this cloak is you could see when you make a possum skin cloak, you're dealing with animal skins, you're dealing with the underarms where the skin is a lot more stretchy, and you're dealing with the leg where the legs join, the skin is stretchy there too. So you can, and also that's where these skins, you've got these skins all joining at one point, and it's usually where the arms or legs are. So the skin is stretchy, and it's really hard to keep your cloak beautifully flat. And I used to try so hard to get my cloak so flat. But looking at this cloak here, I realised that they had as much problems keeping their cloak flat as I did. And there's a big buckle, and I get these all the time. A big buckle in the skins where those stretchy skins are all meeting together. And I just sort of like sat down, and I just went, oh, I realise now that I shouldn't worry so much. It is what it is with the animal skins. It'll always be different. But I really appreciated that connection with these people and with the makers of the cloak and the Wannerua, Arabakal and Warramai ancestors. And I felt that distance condense, and that we were just in the room with the makers of the cloak. Their hands were telling me stories and that I was learning from. So I really appreciated that. I think I spent 2 hours just sitting with the cloak as well, and I appreciated that time that I was given. And this is one of my cloaks that I made when I came back from Kluge-Ruhe, and I changed my stitch to the traditional stitch. You can see I've got a little pucker there. It's going the other way, but it goes in just as much as the pucker that was on the traditional historical cloak. And now I use the stitch. It is so much harder than the feather stitch I described before. But I feel a lot more comfortable using this traditional stitch that I know that our cloaks were done, and also learning and triumphing over this stitch. And again, I just, it takes a lot longer. It takes a lot longer to do this, and to get it straight, and to get it neat and uniform like some of those stitches in the original cloaks. So that's one big thing out of my Kluge-Ruhe trip, is that I changed my stitch. I appreciated that cloak, and also my designs changed on the cloak from that vest that I started at Kluge-Ruhe. I came back and did a lot more community workshops, and here you see a cloak for the Mile Creek Massacre. It was the 10th anniversary of acknowledging this massacre down in New South Wales, and on country they bring their perpetrators, ancestors, descendants of the perpetrators and descendants of the people that were massacred together, and they have a ceremony of reconciliation and acknowledgement of this massacre. And it's one of the only ones in Australia that does that, but it's a really beautiful moment of acknowledgement, I think, when everyone comes together like this. And they asked for the 10th anniversary to make a cloak with the community, so I went there and worked with the community on making this cloak. So that was one of the projects I did immediately after the Kluge-Ruhe as well. This is a cloak that I made before Kluge-Ruhe, going to Kluge-Ruhe, and black seeds, and it talks about Indigenous plants, and I think when I went over to Kluge-Ruhe, I was really keen to actually work with flora and fauna. I think that with bushwalking, I picked up a lot of different types of plants and looked at the differences there, and it was really interesting coming back and just appreciating what we have here, and especially living where I live in the bush. And I've planted a lot more plants, but this cloak went on to later, I think in 2018, and went to the National Portrait Gallery. I had an exhibition, and I really reflected. It's only a small cloak with 12 skins, and I really reflected on what I saw and the largeness of say, El Natsui's Cloaks, and also seeing the cloak in the Smithsonian. So I actually went on, as part of my doctorate thesis, just looked at a lot more different plants that we have here. And these are our native raspberries. And I really love the shape of these raspberries. They're sort of like a squash thing, but the taste is incredible. They're so, they've got such an intense flavour. And I've actually just planted a whole lot of raspberries, and I'm part of a native plant revival system where we regenerate a whole lot of bush areas, planting different fruits. This is our peanut tree. I thought I'd like to show you a few of these. It's a very tall tropical rainforest tree, but the seeds fall down, and inside, and this is a very bad example, but I love the shape. It's a bit wonky. But the peanuts are inside there, and they go black, and they have this lovely peanutty flavour. So again, it's a really important food source. This is our native passion fruit, and it's really tiny, but again, with a very intense flavours. But it's covered with this beautiful protective ferny leaf. And I just love how beautiful that native passion fruit is. And I'm trying to grow some native passion fruit in my garden as well. Again, a lot of native Australian foods are very small, but very intense in their flavouring also, or their calorie value or their protein value, just like the kangaroo grass seeds. What else have I got to show? Oh, the Bunya Cone. This Bunya Cone is from a pine tree, which is a very special and significant spiritual tree that is local to the Kabi people just north of Brisbane, and they had the Bunya Nut Festivals, and I went to the Bunya Nut Festival and received 3 of these large cones. They're really huge. They could weigh about 10 kilos. They're very dense. And it was the first time I really had that many bunyas, and you open them up, and each one of those little, you can see that green outlines is one of these bunya nuts. And the bunya nuts are behind there in the image, in the Coolamon, and you can see how big they are, but they're like large pine nuts is about the only thing. They're very, very rich and very dense with protein. And traditionally these big Bunya Nut festivals were held just north of Brisbane, but up to 10,000 people would gather for these festivals every few years and just feast on these nuts. And the local people supplied the nuts towards, each family would have their own group of trees, and some trees were used, and some trees, the seeds were, if they fell, you wouldn't use all the seeds, they were left for regeneration. So they were a really well managed crop. For my doctorate, I took some of the burnings and ideas from that vest and that intertwining and tried to make a bigger cloak. And this is the start of my skin country cloak, and it's 60 skins. So I went from doing it for 12 skins and then moved on to 60 skins. So it's a huge cloak, because I think I wanted to show the enormity of country and all the different plants. There's over 180 native local plants here to Brisbane, and I worked with a lot of the elders and communities and asked for permissions and protocols. I worked with the Jinnabara people, the Yugambeh people, the Yagara, the Turrbal, the Yugarapool, and the Kabi people, the Quandamooka people. So it was, I think there's about, and there was quite a few discussions and consultations and permissions sought and mapping out where these plants would have been in southeast Queensland. So this cloak, I actually went to a watercolour lessons, and I used ochres like watercolours just to get this intense. How do you make green when ochre is yellow and red? So, and also I used wood ash from some of our fires, the spotted gum and the ironbark wood from some of the gum trees in my garden that had fallen and we'd made fires from. So it was a really good experimentation is what I did. And this is the cloak here. So it's a map of the Brisbane River going out to the sea, and it's really encompasses around about 7 different tribal lands, but it's a map of plants. And if an elder had said to me, this is where this particular tree is, that's where it went on the map. So I privileged Indigenous voices the Aboriginal voices on this mapping, and the bunya nut's right in the top left-hand corner there, because that's where Gubbi Gubbi Kabi Kabi and Jinnabara people's land is up to the left, where I talked to the elders about this bunya nut. So that's, and there was other sight lines between old trees and where these particular things were found. So that's map took a long time, but I'm really proud of the Skin Country cloak, and it was shown in the commute here at the one of IMA with Freya Carmichael as one of the curators, and then we took this cloak to Vancouver Art Gallery. So it's just come back this year, and it was shown in Transits and Returns, an amazing exhibition if you want to look that one up. Yeah, so it's just returned back to Brisbane, and hopefully we'll find a good home, I've been told. This is the back of the cloak, so you can see this is the grey possum I used rather than the brown or black possum, and that's because the grey was found more in this area, coastal and close to the oceans, as you can see down here. A lot of the plants I used too, just interestingly enough, like the names, like jibung is where the traditional name is for the jibung fruit. So our suburbs are named after a lot of Aboriginal names, and that was really interesting to actually put all that together too. Dakabin, and then we've got Winam for the traditional name for the pandanus plant. So I really enjoy putting all that together. But the stitching, again, I used that stitch that was on the Wanneroo Barkle Roramai cloak, and yeah, it took a long time. This is a close-up of some of the work of some of the gums and some of the plants mapped out on the Brisbane River. And the peanut tree is down on the bottom left there, showing the peanuts in its proper darkened, ripened state. This was the National Portrait Gallery that some of my cloaks, my family cloak and that first cloak went to. So was one of my exhibitions that I did after that. And also they had a few other works, this pencil work that I had done earlier, but I just wanted to show you. It's called Not Silenced. And it's all about not silencing our stories and not silencing our voices. And I think there's 6,000 pencils there, or message sticks as I call them, with emu feathers placed in them, and they're sitting on an old school desk and a table. The desk is actually, the pencils are stuffed into the old school desk, and that's sitting on a table. I talk about our issues and stories being tabled, and there's a piece, you can't see the paper, but it's a big roll of paper that comes down to the right. And this is my latest work that's actually currently on exhibition at the Queensland University of Queensland QUT, Queensland University of Technology gallery, the QUT, called Rites of Passage, or Rite of Passage. And this exhibition is a major exhibition curated by Shannon Brett, who is an alumni of the Contemporary Australian Indigenous Art Program. And she has curated artists such as Julie Goff, Nikki Cumpston, Judy Watson, Jenna Lee, Megan Cope, and there's Glennis Briggs, there's Leah King-Smith, there's so many artists, Carla Dickens and myself, in this fantastic exhibition, which I think is online and you can do a virtual tour. So this is my latest cloak called Wreath for Udjuru, and there's over 100 native flowers. The Udjuru, was from Kondamuka country, Minjerribah, and if she could pick a wreath for herself, she was an activist. I imagined this beautiful wreath that she could, it's just honouring some of her work. She was a poet as well, and in the 1970s, there was, in Sydney, there was a big parade or something with the Queen came over here, and to acknowledge the trip of Lieutenant Cook landing in Australia, and she decided to make a leader parade from the Aboriginal mission on the opposite side of the Sydney Harbour than where the Queen was, and they actually got a whole lot of wreaths, and they walked with this parade and let them float in the ocean. And they were like mourning wreaths, mourning for the loss of country. On the other side of the bay was the Queen acknowledging Captain Cook's landing. So, well, not Captain Cook, he wasn't a captain when he visited Australia, he was a lieutenant. So I just wanted to honour her work, her activism, her poetry, and also her country in this cloak. And again, I had permissions and worked with people from Quandamooka mob. So that was my latest work, and latest cloak, again stitched in that very hard stitch. And I'm really proud of this work and how this one has come up. And this is the my repositories of recognition currently at Artisan in Brisbane. So, and that just went up last week. And it's the first time it's been shown since Kluge-Ruhe. So I'm really honoured that this work has been shown. I've had some recognition for it. So that was really nice, because I did make this work. There was no possum bags in the particular installation, but yeah, it was nice to see the tea towels back there again. And the last thing I'm going to show you is some of my clay work. I've got a solo exhibition at a gallery next year, and I'm working with clay vessels, and these are some of my silent sounds, that it is called, and there's 250 of these, acknowledging the 250th year since Captain Cook 1770 landed in Australia and allegedly took possession of Australia. So it talks about some of those issues as well. And that's about it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was so rich. I feel like there are going to be lots of questions. Everybody feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. I'll keep a close eye on that. Carol, as always, I just am reminded, hearing you speak about your work, of how, like, just that Commonwealth Games Commission and how it sort of embraces whoever is there, just like Cloaks embrace people and embraced people in the past. And I don't know, there's just such a, and I've always been so impressed by your attention to relationships and being thorough and intentional and generous with your skills and your experiences. Just going back to share that those photos with the people from where the Smithsonian cloak came from. And I don't know, there's just so many examples of so many, and even just like the way that you honor the possum by going to New Zealand. I don't know, there's just so many beautiful beautiful ways that I feel like that you brought out, or that you expressed how important relationships and connections are for you. I just wanted to, I had a question, because I think maybe you said it and I just missed it, but I was wondering about the Bunion Festivals that you mentioned, where 10,000 people would gather. And I'm just wondering, did those, are those things that happen today or historically, or both?
They happened historically, so 10,000 people gather, and they'd come, like, travel for 3 months to get there once the signals went out that there's a bumper crop, and usually that was every 3 years. But they've just, they are happening today as well. Cool. There's a smaller Bunion Festival that's gaining more momentum, that is run, just on the same sort of, around the same sort of area, the same sort of country, and that it's a lot more people are visiting, but it's incredible to actually see that, because it happens again when the fruit is ripe. And there's a lot of things that happen. There's a baking competition, there's rolling the bunya nut, there's shucking the bunya nut, or bunya cone. They're called cones, the big things. The nuts are actually the little things inside, the nuts inside. So, and you can get around about 100 nuts in one of those big cones. Wow. But it's nice to be to recognise that feasting, but also that link, that continuum. I really love the continuum of the cloaks, and this festival, I think, shows the continuum of being on country and caring for country and looking after particularly the bunya pines, and coming up to contemporary times, that it's still, we're still acknowledging that.
Yeah, so much knowledge expressed in this festival. Mm-hmm. Like, we have a couple questions. Martha says, "This is so wonderful. Thank you both. Where can we see Carol's pieces? She named some places, but I didn't get them down." So, okay, Artisan Gallery in Brisbane.
The QUT Gallery's got rites of passage, and I know they've got, since lockdown, they put a virtual tour online. So that's through, if you just Google Rite of Passage, and that's at the QUT Art Museum. Yeah. And that particular cloak, the wreath for Ujaru, is there, but also some wonderful work by Nikki Cumston and Julie Goff, who also have been to Kluge-Ruhe.
Yeah.
And Judy Watson,
Judy Watson,
so so you can actually have a tour through there. And where else have I got some work at? I think, yes, repositories of recognition is at Artisan, but I don't think there's anything online for my work in particular. So, but Kluge-Ruhe has some good things online about that, and the catalogue for that exhibition, because I took some catalogues in for Artisan as well. And there was something at the Redland Art Gallery, but I think that might have closed, whether they had that online. It was the Redland Art Gallery collection. It was that little black seeds cloak. But also that large cloak, Skin Country, was in the Commute, and it's COMMUTE, and that was in Brisbane, but also in the Vancouver Art Gallery in Transits and Returns. And there might be something online for that one, which I'm particularly proud of, that larger cloak. I don't think I'll make something like that again.
I'll just look around a little bit, and I'll share with everybody who registered those links to the
thanks,
a virtual component. Yeah, I'll share that with everyone. That's wonderful. Thanks, Martha. Another question was, are people continuing to make clothes? So you are, but are other people? And if so, what is represented on them?
Yeah, a lot of other people are now learning to make cloaks, and I think the more that we share, like as I taught quite a few people to make cloaks, and some of these cloaks are community cloaks, so that people might only get a skin and they'll have a story. There's been bush tucker cloaks. I know in Victoria there's a huge contemporary cloak making movement, and Vicky Cousins is making a lot of cloaks. Yes, so each cloak is actually really well considered. You don't just actually make a possum skin cloak. You have to sit down and have a lot of consultation. So the cloak actually needs to tell, like traditionally, tell a story. And because you invest so much in the sewing and the skins and just talking with community, and also the time to make a possum skin cloak, it's important that these consultations and the respect to the story are done from the outset. And I've always practiced that, as I said, with smoking the skins. But the consultations can take, quite a long time. I think I took 2 years for that big cloak, for it to actually all the stories to come for that. So, and decide what it was going to be like. And some things you might not get permission for. You never share something that's not respectful, or that you have to follow community protocols. And if you don't have permission for it, or it's something that is something that only one family can talk about, then you wouldn't put that on a cloak. So these stories are really well considered. There's women's journeys, there's maps being put on cloak, there's community cloaks talking about mapping out their country or mapping out their experiences, and each cloak will have a name and also have a story behind it. So it's just a as I said, it's really well considered. So if you Google possum skin cloaks, you see some of the cloaks that have been made with some of the communities, and there's been some fantastic practitioners, but artists, and also many people have learnt those knowledges. And I think that skill sharing as artists, that's one of our Indigenous artists, it's one of our jobs, is to pass on those knowledges for future generations. And that was why it was important that the knowledge that I learnt from the cloak held in the Smithsonian, to bring that back, rather than actually and share that not only in my thesis but also in discussions and things like what I've shared with you today. Yeah,
you certainly
hope that answers the question.
Yeah, you certainly live up to that value that you hold, really, in a really beautiful way. Someone said the colonists completely shattered the ownership system for the trees by logging them. What a loss. I think maybe that is referencing the pines, like the Bunya pines. Were those logged, I imagine?
Yeah, there was in the 1800s, because the governor of the time did note that they were so special. I mean, this is not my country I'm talking about, but I have, talked to a lot of elders and communities. There was a law passed that none of these special trees, because each family held a group of trees or a particular tree, because some of the larger pines are over 100, 200 years old. And they were such an important resource, and so spiritual as well. The bunya pine is looked at as a person, as an ancestor, and there was a law passed, but actually it wasn't obeyed, so a lot of them were logged. And we do there are old bunya pines, and when you see one, and it's got a beautiful rounded top. It's not a pointed top. This beautiful rounded top, and when you see that, you just gasp and go, "Oh, bunya pine, old man," and you just pay your respects, because these are so significant trees, and you know how long it would have taken to grow, and just the what the tree actually gives too.
Yeah, I think when Bianca Dietzen was here, we'll have to do one of these with her. When she was here, she was talking about one of the bunya pines in her backyard, and how she had just recently lost one, and how, like, what a tragedy that was in so many ways. I remember that. Another question is, I would love to learn how to make some of the colorful ochres. Is this knowledge shared with non-Indigenous people?
I don't usually. If I do a workshop with the skins or teach people about the cloaks, I usually use just normal acrylics. Ochres is something, I've got permission to use all the ochres that I do. I don't just use the ochres again, and I get gifted a lot of ochres to use in workshops, or gifted from different countries, and different tribes have given me as per all my workshops that I've done with people. But there are ochres that you can buy commercially, and those ochres are fine. And yes, you can. They are pigments, and a lot of paints are just made out of clay pigments. So please, if there's anything that's commercial that's out there, I can't give you permission to use that, but obviously you can. That's about all I can say on that one, because I've got ochres that, I've got permission because I know where they've come from. They've been dug from that particular spot on someone's country and gifted to me. But there's stuff that you can buy online. There's stuff that someone like Rick Rosa sells, Australian ochres around the world. And yeah, for anyone to use.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the question about ochres and issues of cultural appropriation, right? Around yes. Those are it's really complex, but it's it was interesting to hear into that.
So it's a hard one to answer, that one.
Yeah, it is.
I hope I answered it correctly, because again, ochres were used in ceremonies, and different colours meant different things, and some were quite spiritual, and some were used for mourning, and you would use your own ochre from a special place. And ochres were traded as well, and different colours were traded. So yeah, there was a whole cultural sort of knowledge is held around ochres, but then again, you can buy commercially things. I know I've got some ochres from the Commonwealth Games, which were bought commercially for a lot of the ceremonies that were held in the Commonwealth Games, but I got gifted lots of it. So, and I use that as well. But I try and label where everything comes from, so that I have in my studio, Common Games, or this is from this country, or this is gifted from there, or this is from there, so that I try and keep track of all this.
Beautiful.
For me.
That attention to where and who and why things were gifted and where things came from is really beautiful. It's interesting too, because using ochres it's sort of, for a non-Indigenous person to use ochres, it's sort of a kind of mining, right? Like it's actually like you're taking the land and using it for your own purpose, which is the relationship to the land is obviously different. And so it's really interesting cultural appropriation and historical question. But we have another question from Polly. She says, "Thank you so much, Carol. I am touched, inspired, and deeply appreciative of your exquisite work, your integrity, authenticity, inclusiveness, and all you acknowledge in this work. Lauren, will a link for this be available to share?" Yes, we are recording this. It will be on our YouTube channel. So you can just type in Kluge-Ruhe YouTube, and you will see it there at the top in the next couple of days. Deanne says, "In Victoria on Wathaurung country, we have had a cloak revival for the past 15 years for ceremony and tandarum." So I think that's more of a comment, but thanks. That's cool. Do you know about that practice?
I didn't hear that. What was that last one?
Oh, I was just wondering if you were aware of that revival happening. I figured that you were. Yeah. I mentioned it earlier too.
I was hoping to get down to Wathaurung country. during the uni break, but I'm not being able to travel, unfortunately, so down there at the moment. But I'll be there and hopefully we can connect.
She says, yes, come.
So what's your name again? Oh, I'll be able to see that one time.
Yeah. Deanne or Dean? Yeah. Somebody else asked, are the skins of other animals besides those of possums considered proper to use for cloaks, or is it just possums?
Yeah, there was traditionally kangaroo skins were used as well, especially when there was a lack of possum skins. Kangaroo skins were large, and sometimes single kangaroo skins were used, and they had artworks put on the same way. And I know around the southeast Queensland, the kangaroo skins were only used as floor coverings, and the cloaks used as cloaks and rugs. But yeah, kangaroo skins. There's a lot of kangaroo skin cloaks. There's a beautiful one in the South Australian Museum that shows that. And there's a few other skins, fragments of skins from other animals as well that I'm investigating. But probably kangaroo was the next one, especially the winter kangaroo or the wallaby skin, especially in winter when their fur is a little bit longer, same with and fluffier and warmer, but they're not as luxurious as the possum. So the possum was always preferred, and the possum fibre is a hollow fibre, so it's like a cane, so it's segmented, so it kept trapped in the heat, and if it was cut at all, or that next segment would still trap in the heat. So it was a very warm, luxurious fur, and I think that some of the old records show, they said that people looked very regal in their cloaks, and a lot of cloaks were traded with the first people who came from Europe to settle here, because they were warm, and they also did their job waterproof, and they were just a beautiful thing to wear. So they were very envious of the cloaks. And I know there was a lot of trade that went on.
Yeah, they're so soft. I remember when you came, it's amazing. They do have such a sense of luxury to them. Kangaroo does too, but in a different way. I agree. Deanne says, beautiful work, Carol. I am Auntie Marlene's daughter, and we would love post-COVID for you to come and show you ochre pits and country. Lots of love.
Oh, thanks, Deanne, and I'd love that too.
Deb says, hi Carol, thanks for the great presentation. Do you know if there was ever use of koala skins in New South Wales?
I don't know in New South Wales. I have heard there is one in Queensland at the moment that's allegedly made from koala skins, a fragment of a cloak that we're looking at, but koalas are called hide-bound, so they were very hard to skin because the hide stuck to the meat. So, whereas possums didn't. So the meat was used as a really important food source, as I said. But then the skins came away. I've skinned, and this sounds terrible, some kangaroos, or had fresh kangaroo skins. I haven't, and also possums, but koalas, of course. I haven't had any experience with it, and I wouldn't, because they're a protected animal. The possums were back in New Zealand, I've had experience with, and the kangaroos were from the hunting. We use kangaroo meat here in the supermarkets. So I did go to a processing plant and got some skins and worked with them from there. So you have to do all those, because they're native animals. You can't just go and take them and try them. But I have heard of koala skins, but again, they weren't usually used because of that particular thing to try and separate them from the animal, as far as I know. I am researching that.
No, that's really interesting. Really interesting. Well, I think that was our last question. If there are any other questions, feel free to send them through. We'll be here for another minute or two. But Carol, I'm just so grateful. I feel like, and those, especially that last image of, not the very last image, but an image of the back of that 60 skin cloak, and that kind of texture, so similar to the metal fabric work that you showed from New York, Sui's work. It's really similar, that shape and the sculptural qualities of it. Penella, did you have a question? You look like
I did, and I can't type it in. So I just wanted to ask Carol, I was curious what size, and now my dogs are going to go off, what size the ceramic pieces are. And now I'm going to mute. Sorry.
They're only small, about that big. Oh, they range for size from about this 12 inches down to 6 inches, I'd say. So they're small.
Thanks for thinking about them in inches for us Americans, Carol. No, it's really interesting. They're cool.
Yeah.
Interesting to see.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to connect with everyone, and Kluge-Ruhe, as I said, you're a very special place because of things like this and the way that you connect objects with people in contemporary and historical, and see that continuum is really important. And I think we all really appreciate that here in Australia. So, and the interest that everyone shows too. I think that your audience is awesome to be able to, just to have that interest and that support. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.